Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 18 of the Theater Challenge. Today, we're going to be talking about sets, and I'm going to have to mute myself. There we go. All right. So today, we're talking about sets and the idea of what goes into those, what makes those great, how those tell the story. So I'm going to jump in. Instead of putting application at the end today, I'm going to just basically be weaving in application steps as we go and kind of talking about sets within the application. But if you have questions, then I will be open at the end. I'm going to do this for about 15 minutes. So if at the end of the talk you have some questions about sets, we can jump into those and you can leave a comment and I will pick those up. All right, so let's jump in. Yesterday, actually, I got to talk to a director named Cole Groot about sets, and he shared some thoughts with me that I thought were really valuable, and I'm excited to share with you guys. So basically, let's just start at, let's say you've never designed a set before. And just to be honest, I haven't done huge sets before. I've not directed a huge show where I needed like moving pieces all the time and things like that. So that's in particular why I got his take on things, because he has done shows like that. But one of the first things that Cole said you should do when thinking about your sets is you want to think about your audience. What is their perspective on the show, and how are you going to tell the story to your audience and yet leave room for the imagination? So what he was saying, if I'm telling the story, let's take the example of Pirates Penzance. If you don't know what Pirates Penzance is, you should go look it up. But the first act all takes place on a beach, or it could take place starting in a ship, but usually it's just on the beach right away. And I've been in a couple shows of this. Usually the sets are done pretty simple, just to give elements of the beach. Like the last one I was in, all that was on stage were some rocks to give the idea of being on a beach. So we didn't need a huge elaborate backdrop and sand everywhere, rocks and whatever else, shells that you might find on a beach. Just needed the elements to give the idea to the audience that this is at a beach and their imagination could fill in the rest. So we're not overburdening our audience by creating a set. At the same time, there's going to be some times where you have the ability to use bigger sets or more sets, and that can be very useful for your show. If you've ever seen a show with Sight and Sound Theaters, they typically use some pretty big sets and they have a humongous stage, and I love how they handle that. There's so many pieces moving together, but the action is very centered, so you always know what to focus on, but you can always watch a different piece of what's happening. But those are kind of two contrasts. But make sure that you're not worried about communicating everything to your audience as far as, if I'm at a beach scene, then I have to show you the entire beach. No, I can just give you elements and trust you that your imagination will fill in the rest. Then another thing to think about is the standpoint of your budget. I've done some $0 budget shows before, and you just don't really have anything for sets unless you have some time to put in and some donations of wood and whatnot, painting and all that. But you can, if you put in the time and effort, you can make, like I was talking about, those elements. But that is a really important thing to consider right up front, is your audience perspective and the budget that you actually have to work with. Because if you have, let's say you even have a $500 budget for sets, you don't want to be going off on one scene and creating, an elaborate thing just for that then you're going to get rid of, and the rest of the show is just going to be bare. So think about those two things when you're first approaching sets. Second, communicate. So first of all, you've got to communicate with your team. If I was putting on the musical Music Man, I know there's going to be some dancing in that show, right? So I need to think not just from the perspective of director or set designer. I also need to think from the perspective of choreographer and be communicating as a team with all of these people so that I understand, okay, we need we need a platform here, we need a flat plane here, we need a bridge here for this scene. But making sets that are actually serving the show that you're performing, in order to do that, you have to talk with your team and all be on the same page. So whether you're the set designer or director or both, make sure that you're actually communicating with your team to understand what has to be there. And then when you actually go to communicate the vision of what the sets are to your team, this is something that's really important. You have to get what's in here out onto paper, or in some way put the vision in front of them, because you want to do a lot of upfront work. It's much better to lay it out on paper, even if it's rough drawings. In talking with Cole yesterday, he said sometimes directors will make their set plans out like a house plan, like a blueprint. But you can just make pictures. Just make sure that they're clear and they're actually communicating what you're looking for as the director, when you go to approach your team. Because if you don't, if they look at the picture and it's not very clear, then I mean, you're probably going to end up with a set that you weren't wanting, and it's going to take a lot of work on the back end to redo a lot of things, to remake things, and it's just that time could have been saved if you communicated up front. So make sure that you're not just communicating with your team, but also clearly to your team. All right, number 3, let's talk about levels. I love levels. After having choreographed some shows where it's all one flat plane, it's so nice. You realize how much levels actually mean when you've just choreographed on one flat stage, and then you see the difference of people all performing just on that stage versus like having a couple levels, like having a platform maybe just a foot off the ground, maybe a couple feet, maybe high up in the air, like 20 feet in the air. Levels are your friend, usually, because you're helping the audience understand more about the story. Because when everybody's just on one flat plane, and this is something that can be applied even if you're performing on a stage and it has some steps, consider using the steps, especially if you have some choreography, because if you're just on one flat plane, it looks much more chaotic if all of your dancers are just on that one platform, one space, versus having a couple levels that they can be watching. And it visually makes the entire picture bigger to your audience. So I love levels. It doesn't fit with every show, but consider levels as you can, as you're able to, because they're pretty cool and they just expand your audience's viewpoint of the story. Number 4, connect. Okay, think big picture is basically what this one is. So you're probably, if you're working with a small budget and you don't have a lot of time to put into sets, because the 30-day theater challenge is not a lot of time, start thinking big picture in the sense that you're taking 2 factors into consideration. Number 1, think about diversifying each set. So let's say you are building a set, you don't necessarily want to have one big mansion that you have to roll on stage for one scene and then roll off for another, and then you have a big train that you have to roll on stage for the next scene and then roll off and bring the mansion back on. If that works, fantastic. Go ahead, build a mansion and a train. But you can diversify in the sense that you use one set piece that can actually be folded out. Like, let's say you use the mansion and then you fold it out and boom, it's a train. Or I've seen some sets that have 3 sides, so they're a triangle, and you see this one side for one scene, and then you turn it, you rotate a little bit, and it suddenly creates a different scene, and they move it to a different side of the stage, and then they rotate it again, and they move it to another side of the stage. Completely different scene. Not because your set piece changed, but because you just turned it a little bit. One of my favorite examples of simple yet powerful set pieces, I was in a musical called The Story, which was basically just to walk through a lot of different characters of the Bible. And all we did for that was we had a set of steps, 2 sets of steps that could be locked together and rolled around, or they could be taken apart and, you know, placed anywhere on the stage. And they were so well used that, you know, just simple things. At one point for the story of David and Goliath, we connected the 2 pieces, put them on stage, downstage left, and then a bunch of us just stood on different levels of the set, and we became Goliath. So like the people at the top, they spoke together and they were the voice of Goliath. Then the people in the middle, they moved their outside arms at the same time and they were the arms of Goliath. And then the people at the bottom, I was one of them, and we would walk in sync. So we were the feet of Goliath. You can do things like that. You can actually have your actors be a part of the set in a way too. Or I guess in some ways that was still a character. But in the same show, we would also sometimes be a part of the set. Like there were curtains that we would hold too. There were just 4 curtains that came down at different points on stage, and we'd move the curtains around. That was it, besides like one platform in the back that had a cross on it that was built over the course of the show. That was it. It was a super simple set, but very powerful in the way it was used. So just thinking about, sorry, you got off on the rabbit trail. Diverse sets, though. Those are things that are simple, and yet if you use them well, they can be really powerful because they're not distracting your audience by how big and elaborate and fancy they are. They're simple enough that your audience gets the picture and they can focus on the story and be drawn into it. And it's a beautiful thing. I love super simple sets that are done really well. But then you also have to think about your stage crew. Your actors can be your stage crew. In the case of the story, the actors were pretty much the stage crew. We were moving the pieces as the story went. But you have to think about how much time your stage crew needs to move sets on and off, to reposition them on the stage and all of that. So think big picture when you go to create these sets. And then number 5, make mistakes. This is, again, kind of one of those hard things. You don't want to make mistakes. You don't want things to look bad, but be willing to make mistakes and just learn from your experience making sets. Learn what feels good, what doesn't, by stepping back into the audience. There's something called the 20-foot rule, because your audience is usually 20 feet away from you, 20 feet or more. But as you're creating a set, as you're building it, as you're painting it, always step back to where your audience will be and see it from their eyes, to know whether, you know, if I really want those. I think, Susan was saying in the costumes email this week, she was saying if plaids don't match up perfectly, but then you step back into the perspective of the audience and it's fine, then don't worry about it. But if your audience is looking at the sets and something is just a flat painting, this is something Cole Group brought up. If the painting is just flat and there's no texture to it, then that doesn't necessarily draw them into the story as much, because someone just slapped paint up there. Unless it's something like Seussical and you just need flat, brilliant colors. But that's where, again, think about your story. What serves the story? What colors, what essences actually serve the story and will help pull the audience in. Some mistakes to avoid, however, are making dangerous sets. Do not make dangerous sets. You have a responsibility to keep every single person on stage safe. So your stage crew, your actors, you have to keep those people safe. Do not make sets, you know, it's already a dangerous, like being on stage with all these flies, heavy flies above your head and huge sets rolling around. It can already be a dangerous place. Do not make, don't make sloppy sets that could fall apart if you don't finish them or complete them well. So that's something to avoid. And the other thing, like I talked about, always come back to the perspective of your audience and avoid the mistake of not seeing it through their eyes. So there's 15 minutes, no questions, so I'm just going to leave it there. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with some emails about the technical side of theater. All right, bye.